Michigan is often remembered for what it built: cars, factories, timber fortunes, mining wealth, and the kind of working towns that once gave the state its backbone. But scattered across that history are places that tell a different story. Towns that rose quickly when money was flowing, then lost their purpose the moment that money dried up. Some were emptied out so completely that almost nothing remains except broken foundations and a place name on an old map. Others were not erased in a single moment. They were slowly abandoned by economics, by geography, by weather, or by the quiet reality that once a town's only reason for existing is gone, very little can save it. That is what makes Michigan's lost towns so unsettling. They are not always dramatic. Some did not burn. Some were not destroyed by war or catastrophe. They simply stopped mattering to the system that created them. A mine closed. A forest was cut bare. A port went quiet. And then the people followed the jobs somewhere else, leaving behind streets, houses, docks, and churches that no longer had a future. In some cases, nature stepped in and finished the work, swallowing whole communities so thoroughly that they feel more like legends than real places. In others, the remains are still there, silent but stubborn, as if waiting for someone to explain why life once gathered there at all. The first place on that list is Mandan, and this one does not belong in the category of towns that are merely fading. Mandan is finished. It was created in the late 19th century as a copper mining company town in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, and from the start, its existence depended almost entirely on a single operation. There was no broader local economy underneath it, no backup industry waiting in the wings, and no second identity that might keep it going if mining failed. Mandan lived because the mine lived. That was the whole arrangement. As long as the company needed workers there, houses were occupied, roads had purpose, and the settlement made sense. The moment the mine shut down, the town's fate was practically sealed. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but something quieter and in some ways more final. Without the mine, Mandan had nothing to anchor it. There was no port economy strong enough to absorb the blow, no tourism industry to reinvent the place, and no nearby urban pull to keep residents rooted there. People simply began leaving, and once enough of them did, the town stopped functioning as a town. Homes were torn down, left to sag, or collapsed into the landscape. Roads lost their destination. Daily life disappeared. Today, Mandan feels less like an abandoned community, and more like an archaeological trace of one. If Mandan died when its industry ended, Singapore died because its industry failed and nature made sure nothing would come back. In the 19th century, Singapore stood along the shore of Lake Michigan as both a logging center and a port town, and for a brief time it looked like a place with real momentum. Timber was abundant. Ships moved goods in and out. And the town grew quickly on the confidence of a resource economy that seemed profitable enough to last. On the surface, it had all the familiar signs of a successful frontier settlement: commerce, expansion, and the kind of fast energy that comes when people believe they are building something permanent. But Singapore had one problem that made all of that confidence far more fragile than it appeared. It was built on sand dunes. As long as the surrounding forests were still standing, those dunes were partly stabilized. Trees broke the wind and helped hold the landscape in place. But once the logging industry stripped the area bare, the town lost more than its long-term economic future. It also lost its environmental protection. The wind coming off Lake Michigan suddenly had room to move the sand much more aggressively, and over time the dunes began to shift. Houses, roads, and businesses were slowly buried. The same industry that had created Singapore also helped set the conditions for its physical destruction. Then, when the timber economy declined, there was little reason for people to stay and fight what nature was already taking back. One by one they left, until the town disappeared beneath the sand, almost as if the land had decided to erase the experiment entirely. That is what makes Singapore one of the strangest lost towns in Michigan. It is not just abandoned, it is buried. Its remains lie under the dunes near Sleeping Bear. And part of its eerie power comes from the fact that it has never been fully gone in the imagination. Under certain conditions, traces are said to reappear, only to vanish again. Sheldrake tells a more understated story, but not a less revealing one. This small town stood along Whitefish Bay on Lake Superior and functioned as a lumber community and minor port in the late 19th century. Like so many places in Michigan's resource economy, it depended on what the surrounding land could provide. While the forests were still standing, Sheldrake had work, movement, and enough purpose to hold a settlement together. Timber gave the town its pulse. But once the trees were cut and the logging frontier moved on, Sheldrake found itself exposed in every sense of the word. It was never a large town, and that mattered. Big places sometimes survive collapse because they have enough infrastructure, capital, or location advantages to attract something new. Sheldrake had none of that. It was too remote, too small, and too narrow in its economic purpose to reinvent itself after logging declined. Harsh conditions along Lake Superior only made things worse. Fires damaged parts of the town, and the weather in that region has never been gentle. Over time, the businesses closed, the houses emptied, and whatever remained of local momentum drained away. Today, Sheldrake hardly reads as a town at all. It survives more as a historic trace than a living place, held together by memory, shoreline geography, and scattered remains rather than any active civic identity. If Sheldrake slipped away little by little, Fayette met a much sharper ending. Established in the mid-19th century on the shore of Michigan's Garden Peninsula, Fayette was built for one reason alone: iron smelting. It was the definition of a company town. The homes, the stores, the church, and the daily rhythm of life all revolved around a single industrial operation. As long as the furnaces burned, Fayette looked like a place with stability. Workers had jobs, families had a routine, and the town appeared to have a future anchored in industry. But that stability was always more fragile than it seemed, because everything depended on one business staying profitable. Once production costs climbed and outside competition intensified, the company made its decision and shut the plant down. The effect was immediate. Without the smelting works, Fayette no longer had a reason to function, and within a very short time, the town lost the purpose that had been holding it together. People packed up and left, buildings were closed, and daily life stopped almost in place. What makes Fayette stand out is that, unlike many other abandoned towns, it was not stripped away after the collapse. Much of it remained standing. Because of that, Fayette became one of Michigan's most remarkably preserved ghost towns. Today, Fayette Historic State Park presents a place that looks almost unsettlingly intact, as if people could return at any moment, even though the town has been empty for well over a century. Pear Cheney unraveled in a very different way, and in some respects, a more haunting one. This was a late 19th century lumber town, built on the twin forces that sustained so many frontier communities: timber, and the railroads that moved it. As long as logging remained active, the town had work, movement, and enough confidence to hold families in place, but then something arrived that no company ledger or rail connection could control. Disease spread through the community, including diphtheria and other highly contagious illnesses that were especially deadly in that era. In a small town, the losses were devastating. When children died, when whole families were hit, fear moved even faster than the sickness itself. That fear changed the town as much as the disease did. People began leaving, not because a mine closed or a mill shut down overnight, but because the emotional center of the community had been broken. Schools closed, social life collapsed. And then, when the lumber economy also weakened, there was nothing left to pull people back. Pear Cheney did not disappear in one dramatic instant. It was abandoned in spirit before it was abandoned physically. Today, almost nothing remains of the town itself. What endures most visibly is the cemetery in the woods, where children's gravestones still stand as the clearest record of what happened there. After places like Pear Cheney that truly fell silent, Harrison represents a different and quieter stage of decline. This is not a town that has been abandoned. It still exists, still functions, and still has residents trying to hold daily life together. But Harrison also shows what it looks like when a town remains on the map, while becoming harder and harder to sustain. It is often described as one of the poorest communities in Michigan, and the economic reality is difficult to ignore. Household income sits far below the state average, poverty is high, and a large share of the town's residents live with the kind of financial strain that gradually wears down both families and local institutions. The local economy depends heavily on low-paying work and seasonal activity, including small retail, basic services, and some recreation-related business. That creates a long-term problem for younger residents. The choices are limited, and for many, the path forward leads somewhere else. They leave for college, training, or work, and too often they do not come back. What remains is a town shaped increasingly by older residents, inexpensive housing, and a downtown that struggles to keep businesses alive year-round. Harrison has not become a ghost town, but it carries the warning signs of a place losing its future in slow motion. Mayo faces a problem that is harder to solve than a single factory closure or one failed industry. Its biggest burden is scale. This is a very small town deep in the forested interior of Michigan's northeastern Lower Peninsula, far from major economic engines, and far from the kind of population base that can create momentum on its own. That distance shapes everything. Local opportunity remains narrow, tied mostly to forestry, basic services, and seasonal work, which means the town has very little room to absorb change when one part of the economy weakens. That fragility shows up in the numbers. Recent estimates put median household income in Mayo well below the statewide level, while poverty remains relatively high. But the deeper issue is not just income. It is what income tells people about their future. In towns like Mayo, younger residents often leave because staying can feel like standing still. They go for college, work, or simply for the chance to live somewhere with more than one path forward. What remains is a smaller, older community, relatively low-cost housing, and a downtown that survives more than it grows. Mayo is still there, but it feels like a place living on a reduced scale, always one step away from becoming quieter than it already is. If Mayo feels small and vulnerable, Ontonagon adds another layer of difficulty, isolation that is both geographic and structural. Sitting on the shore of Lake Superior in one of Michigan's least populous counties, Ontonagon once had more ways to matter. Its port, its forestry economy, and its links to regional industry gave the town a working purpose that connected it to the broader life of the Upper Peninsula. But as those older economic pathways weakened, Ontonagon was left with too few replacements strong enough to carry the same weight. That is what makes the town feel so exposed now. Stores are still open, homes are still occupied, and daily life has not disappeared. But the pace is slower, the options are fewer, and the demographic pattern tells its own story. Ontonagon County today has a notably older population, limited household income compared with the state overall, and a labor market that leans heavily on local services, government, and seasonal activity rather than strong, long-term expansion. Distance only magnifies that weakness. When a town is this far from larger economic centers, reinvention becomes much harder. Ontonagon still functions, but it does so with the feel of a place that has learned how to endure without really finding a new engine for the future. Flint represents a different kind of decline altogether, larger, harsher, and far more visible. This was once one of the defining industrial cities in the United States, central to the rise of General Motors, and so closely tied to the auto industry that Vehicle City became part of its identity. Flint was not a marginal town. It was a place that helped shape modern American manufacturing. But when the auto sector contracted and jobs disappeared on a massive scale, the city lost far more than payrolls. It lost the economic structure that had once held whole neighborhoods together. Then came the water crisis, which pushed Flint into national consciousness for a different reason. In 2014, the city's drinking water became contaminated after a disastrous management decision, exposing residents, including many children, to lead and other risks. The public health damage was immense, and the crisis deepened an already powerful sense of distrust and instability. Even though official monitoring now says Flint's water system has met state and federal LEED standards for multiple consecutive testing periods, the legacy of that disaster has not simply vanished. What Flint looks like today reflects all of that accumulated damage. There are still active neighborhoods, institutions, and people fighting for the city, but there are also boarded houses, vacant lots, and stretches of urban blight near long-dead industrial zones. Some parts of Flint really do resemble small urban ghost towns, where homes and businesses feel less abandoned all at once than hollowed out over time. The city's struggles with vacancy and disinvestment have been documented for years, and those patterns remain part of its landscape. Inkster unraveled in near silence. There was no single catastrophe dramatic enough to pull cameras in from across the country. No poisoned water, no one moment that forced the entire nation to stop and look. Instead, Inkster was worn down the slower way, through shrinking industry, declining opportunity, and the steady departure of residents who no longer believed the city could still offer them a future. Inkster grew in the shadow of Detroit, tied closely to the industrial machine that powered southeastern Michigan for generations. Auto plants, warehouse work, transportation, and blue-collar jobs gave the city its reason to exist. Families could build stable lives there because the regional economy still had room for them. But when those industries contracted, Inkster was left exposed. It did not have a second engine strong enough to catch the fall. The jobs thinned out, the tax base weakened, and public strain started creeping into everyday life. At one point, the city was pushed close enough to fiscal crisis that even basic services felt vulnerable. That pressure changed the character of the place. Population losses deepened, incomes stayed low, and poverty remained stubbornly high. At the same time, concerns over crime, especially property crime and violence, added another reason for younger families to look elsewhere. Once that pattern begins, it feeds itself. Fewer families mean less neighborhood stability. Less stability makes it harder for local businesses to survive. And the more storefronts close and houses decline, the easier it becomes for the next wave of people to decide they should leave too. The Keweenaw Peninsula tells a larger and more haunting story because it is not just one fading town. It is an entire region shaped by what happens after an economic era ends. Once, this narrow stretch of land was the heart of Michigan's copper empire. Wealth poured out of the ground, towns expanded, immigrant communities filled the streets, and an entire regional identity was built around mining. But when the copper economy weakened, the peninsula did not collapse in one dramatic instant. It thinned out. It aged. It was left behind in layers. That is what makes Keweenaw so fascinating and so sad at the same time. In one compact region, you can see every stage of decline. There are places that are fully gone. True ghost towns, where almost nothing survives but ruins and a name in the historical record. There are other places that still exist in the technical sense, still with houses, roads, and a small year-round population, but which no longer feel economically alive. In towns like Ahmeek and Mohawk, the structures remain, but the energy that once justified them is mostly gone. Big buildings stand half-used. Populations remain tiny. The future is rarely framed in terms of expansion, only endurance. What has replaced the old mining logic is something thinner and less rooted. In many parts of the peninsula, homes are now used seasonally rather than year-round. Some communities survive more through memory, tourism, heritage, and second home ownership than through any broad-based local economy. That shift changes the meaning of a place. A region can still be beautiful, still be historic, still attract visitors, and yet no longer function as a place where large numbers of people can build stable, long-term lives. Calumet is the clearest expression of that paradox. If you want to understand what happens when a powerful town does not fully die, but no longer truly lives the way it once did, Calumet is the place to look. At its peak, this was one of the richest copper centers anywhere in the world. It was not a rough outpost. It was a place of confidence and scale with theaters, opera houses, hotels, and a dense immigrant population that made it feel urban, ambitious, and globally connected. Calumet once had the architecture of certainty. It was built as though prosperity would go on indefinitely. Then the mines closed, and that certainty vanished. But unlike smaller mining towns that were wiped almost completely off the map, Calumet remained standing. That is what gives it such a strange emotional weight today. The buildings are still there, and many of them are still magnificent. In fact, some look almost too grand for the town around them now. They seem to belong to a place larger, louder, and richer than the one that exists today. That visual mismatch is the whole story. The physical shell survived, but the economic life that once filled it did not. Now Calumet lives in a kind of in-between condition. It has not disappeared. People still live there, history still draws attention, and preservation has given the town a second identity. But that second identity is rooted mostly in remembrance. Parts of downtown feel active, yet many spaces are empty, underused, or sustained more by heritage than by a living economy. If Calumet became a monument to a world that ended, then Manistique feels more like a town trying to keep moving after the engine has already lost power. Sitting on the shore of Lake Michigan, Manistique once had a clear reason to matter. Timber, paper, the railroad, and local industry gave the town work, direction, and a rhythm that tied daily life to production. As long as those systems were running, Manistique was more than a scenic place on the map. It was a working town, one with a real economic pulse and enough purpose to hold people in place. The problem is that towns built around a few core industries can look stable right up until those industries start thinning out. That is what happened here. Some industrial operations closed, others shrank, and what remained was no longer strong enough to carry the same weight. Manistique did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It simply started losing energy. Jobs became narrower, opportunities grew more limited, and younger residents began making the choice so many young people in small towns eventually make. Leave now, because staying may mean living inside a future that keeps getting smaller. City planning materials now describe an economy led more by healthcare, schools, government, a paper mill, and tourism than by the broader industrial base that once defined the town. That is what makes Manistique so revealing. On the surface, it still looks normal. Houses are occupied, businesses are open, streets still function as everyday streets. But underneath that appearance is a town leaning heavily on a few sectors that may not be enough to create strong long-term renewal. The downtown survives, but it feels fragile rather than fully confident. Lance survives on a narrower edge. Set along Keweenaw Bay on Lake Superior, it still has the shape and administrative importance of a functioning small town, And for a long time, that was enough. Port activity, logging, local government, and basic regional services gave it a practical role in the Upper Peninsula. Even today, it still functions as an entry point for the surrounding area, which is why it is often described as a gateway to Baraga County. But being a gateway is not the same as being a destination, and that difference matters more than it first appears. What Lance faces is not spectacular decline, but gradual limitation. The town still works, yet its economic range remains tight. Local life depends on a mix of public sector employment, basic services, and some continuing connection to the waterfront. But there is little sense of a broad new engine arriving to change the trajectory. The deeper problem is one of gravity. Places like Lance can remain stable for years, while still slowly losing their future. Long winters, distance from larger economic centers, and limited job variety make it harder to attract the kind of younger households that bring renewal. So the town continues, but with a lighter pulse. People pass through, some stay, many do not. Lance is not dying in a dramatic sense. It is holding on, but the breath feels shallow, and that is often how slow fade towns look before anyone is willing to call them that. Baraga sits even closer to that line. Among small Upper Peninsula communities, it stands out not because it has disappeared, but because its economic room to maneuver feels so narrow. This is the kind of town that survives less through growth than through endurance. There are still people there, still institutions, still daily routines that make it a real place rather than a forgotten one. But when a town's options stay limited for too long, survival itself can start to look like stagnation. The numbers tell part of the story. Recent estimates place median household income in Baraga well below the statewide level, while poverty remains elevated for such a small community. The village population has also been trending downward in recent years, another familiar sign that younger residents are not being replaced quickly enough. Jobs are concentrated in public services, local businesses, small-scale forestry, and the kinds of economic activities that mostly circulate money within the same community instead of drawing in major outside momentum. That creates a closed-loop feeling, enough to keep the town standing, not enough to push it forward. And that is where Baraga starts to feel especially fragile. When incomes stay low, when the labor market remains tight, and when too many young adults leave for better options elsewhere, the town begins aging in place. The houses remain, the roads remain, the community identity remains, but the future gets thinner. Baraga is not a ghost town today. It still has too much life for that, but it carries the unmistakable signs of a place nearing the stage where abandonment no longer looks like a sudden event. It looks like a long, slow surrender to limited choices, reduced scale, and the quiet mathematics of not having enough reasons for the next generation to stay.